Welcome to Unit 7. Today we're going to continue with modal logic, get into some pretty interesting philosophical problems and arguments, and then we'll start into informal fallacies, which is another very different aspect of logic. And we'll continue with these two things the next few classes. Before doing this unit, I suggest you do these 4 problems, modal problems, and a couple of them involve ambiguous arguments, we'll see. And read ahead on informal fallacies and try to master the modal proofs. Okay, so let's review the modal proofs a little bit. You have 4 new inference rules. First of all, you reverse squiggles. So if you have not necessary something, therefore possible not, or not possible A, therefore necessary not A. To use these, you have to have not necessary or not possible. Start the whole formula. The rest of the formula could be big. So you can't use these if the not possible or the not necessary is like inside parentheses. You do this pretty much automatically. You can start the step and then ignore it from then on. Then you drop diamonds before boxes. Every time you drop a diamond, you got to use a new world. So it's possible that A, so A is possible in world W. You use the worlds in order. B is possible, so it's possible in world WW. What's possible is true, as it were, in a story, but it need not, as a possible world is like a story, but it need not be a story that you've been telling so far. You got to start a new story every time you drop a possible. Lastly, drop boxes, and where do you put it? In any world with a W, you put it, and sometimes in the actual world. If you don't have any other worlds, or if you have something not modalized without a modal operator like necessary or possible in the original argument. Never use a new world when you drop a box. Always use a new world when you drop a diamond. Okay, and here's an example of 2 arguments. You have the valid one, you assume the opposite, not possible A, and then you reverse squiggle, therefore necessary not A, and then you drop the diamond into a new world, and you can simplify. Then last of all, you drop the box in the old world, and there you go. So you reverse squiggles first, drop initial diamonds, using a new world each time. Lastly, drop the boxes into old worlds. Never use a new world. The invalid one works the same way, except here you have 2 possibles to drop, and they go into 2 different worlds. And then the box goes into both worlds, and then you get a refutation to, refute the argument. Okay. What am I doing here? I had you do 4 English arguments. This one is from what used to be one of my favorite philosophers, A.J. Ayer. He was popular about 50 years ago, and he was one of my favorite philosophers because he disagreed with me about almost all major philosophical issues. When you're doing philosophy, it's good to have in mind someone who disagrees with you, because maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, maybe you can learn from them, maybe you can sharpen your arguments to defend your views better, but you've got to think in terms of your view and your opponent's view. Very important in philosophy. In this area, in this argument, he's concerned with what philosophy is, and particularly how it differs from science. And he holds that science is about what you can show by sense experience, including experimentation. Philosophy isn't about that. It's not experimental. It's about logical connections between ideas, ultimately between words. And he gives this as an example of a good philosophical argument. Unfortunately, it really isn't. Um, First premise, it's necessarily true that if you're morally responsible for your actions, then you're free. Okay. Why is that true? Well, he says because of the two concepts, how they relate. Being morally responsible involves that you're free to do the action, but whatever that means, that's the question. The second premise he gives, it's necessarily true that if your actions are uncaused, then you aren't morally responsible. I'm not sure what he means by uncaused. He might be talking about free will and determinism. Maybe your actions aren't necessitated by your character or something else. Maybe they're random, they don't have a cause. Then you wouldn't be responsible if they weren't. If they were random, you wouldn't be responsible for what you do. Maybe that's what he has in mind. A person who believes in free will would believe that you caused the action, not the prior state of your brain or anything else. That wouldn't seem to deny the moral responsibility. So I'm not sure exactly what he means by this, which is kind of a unclarity in the argument. The conclusion is you're free doesn't determine your actions are uncaused. Not necessary. If free, then uncaused. There you go. Is it a good argument? Well, I think it's a certain word is unclear there. But the problem is it's not valid. And if you try to prove it, you will see that. So let's see. Let's work it out. Block off the conclusion. Assume the opposite. Then you reverse squiggles, but there aren't any. You drop diamonds, so there aren't any. And you say, this is a very funny modal argument. So we got to do the last thing now. Drop the boxes. Now, class, what do you think? Should we use a new world W or the actual world? What do you think? Jimmy, the actual world. Right. You never go into a new world when you drop a box. So you drop these in the actual world. It's necessary that if R then F, therefore, in the actual world, if R then F, and you drop the other boxes. If U, then not R, and if F, then U. Oh, my handwriting is terrible. Yuck. Okay. So then what do? Well, you're stuck, right? You can't drive anything from these, so you got to break something. Let's say we assume not R. Then this is broken. We can't drive anything. This is broken. We can't drive anything. We've got to affirm the first or deny the second. This one we got to break down too. So assume not F. So there you go. You stop. Why do you stop? Because all the complicated ones here are broken. You have one part true or false, but not what you need to infer. The same thing here. So then you refute it. You have one possible world where you're not morally responsible and you're not free. In the actual world. So in every world, if R, then F. That's the only world, and that's true because R is false, so that's true. In every world, if you have U true, then you have R false. So you got R false in every world, so false, true. That's true in every world. Anything implies true is true. and then you ignore the not, and every world where you have F, you have U. Well, you don't have F ever, so this is false. False implies anything is true, and that's true in all worlds. So it's necessary, not necessary is not true is false. So you have true premises, false conclusion. So you have invalid, and there you go. So poor A.J. Ayer, well, not a valid argument. Now, suppose that A.J. Ayer was your friend, and before he gave his book out to be published, he asked you to read it and make suggestions. Philosophers do that all often. Now, suppose you find this invalid argument. You say, Ayer, you can't do this. You're giving this as an example of a good argument, but it's not valid. How would you suggest that you fix it? If you could add something, you could add a premise to make it valid. What do you think? What do you think? Jimmy again. Why don't you add R as a premise? Well, that would work. Yeah. If you had another premise, you're morally responsible for your action. Then you could work it out. It would be valid. I don't want to do it, but it would. Could you have a still weaker premise that would make it valid? Any? Well, possible R. That would work, wouldn't it? I think so. Yeah, if you have possible R, you put that in the possible world, you put everything else, yeah, you'd get a contradiction. That would be better philosophically. Why? You establish the conclusion with weaker premises. Weaker premises are harder to dispute. So you have a stronger argument that way. So that would have made it work. Would it be still a good argument? Anyway. Number 6 is about the meaning of life and whether it would be life would be meaningless if it didn't go on forever. Now, I'm a Christian. I believe in an afterlife, heaven and that sort of thing that goes on forever. So we're destined for eternal life, which to me makes it pretty meaningful. Suppose we didn't have eternal life. Would life be meaningless? If when you die, that ceases your existence. Well, I don't think so. I think that it wouldn't be as meaningful as if it goes on forever, but it'd still be meaningful. And that's what this argument is about. If life doesn't go on forever, could it still be meaningful? It's very complicated. It's rather complicated, though. If one's conscious life won't continue forever entails life is meaningless, that's this, then a finite span of life is meaningless, F. If a finite span of life is meaningless, then an infinite span of life is meaningless also. It's just more of the same. But if an infinite span of life is meaningless, then one's conscious life will continue forever entails life is meaningless. Therefore, if it's possible that life is not meaningless, possible not L, then one's conscious life won't continue forever, doesn't entail life is meaningless. Pretty complicated stuff, but it is valid. How does it work? Assume the opposite. Not possible, not L, implies not necessary, not C implies L. Okay, kind of complicated. So false if then, therefore first part true, second part false, so if necessary, if not C, then L. Okay, but then this one matches the if part in the first premise. So you can say if then, first part's true, therefore second part's true. So you get F and star that, and then F F implies I, therefore I, and you get I implies the box thing, therefore the box thing, C implies L. And then what do? Well, a couple more steps, you get a contradiction. It's not all that hard. So you get possible not L, so you imagine not L true in a possible world, and you dump the necessary things in the same possible world. If not C, then L. If C, then L. Now, according to our strategy, we dump it in the actual world too, because you have letters without boxes or diamonds in the premises. However, if you see that you're going to get a contradiction anyway, you can just do it, get the contradiction, and there you go. So you can use these three together to get a contradiction. Not C implies L, but not L. Neither second, therefore neither first. You get C, and then C. C implies L, therefore L. Contradiction. And so the assumption leads to a contradiction and therefore is wrong, and you conclude the opposite of the conclusion. I wrote that instead of this long conclusion. I'm getting lazy. Okay, there you go. Now, 7 and 8 go together. They're really the same argument in terms of the form. One is about money, the other is about knowledge. The important one is 8, about knowledge. This is thrown in because it's somewhat easier to understand, and it's the same argument in terms of its form. So if for money you substitute knowledge, and for broke you substitute mistaken, you just substitute letters here, and you get here. And the purpose of this is to give you an example of a simpler argument which commits the same fallacy. Okay, 8 is an argument for skepticism, which is the view that knowledge is impossible. We know nothing. If you've read Descartes in your Intro to Philosophy, you might recall that he had some arguments about that. So, how does it go? If you know, then you couldn't be mistaken. How could you know if you're mistaken, right? If you know, you couldn't be mistaken. But you could be mistaken. You could always be mistaken about something, even what you think is the most clearly true, except for one thing. Descartes said, your own existence. You couldn't be mistaken about your own existence, because to be mistaken, you'd have to exist, and thus you couldn't be mistaken if you think that you exist. Okay, anyway, therefore you don't know. So apart from that one example, you could always be mistaken. So human knowledge is impossible. In class, I like to have a pencil, and I give it to a student. I say, do you know that this is a pencil? And the student plays with it for a while, and you write something, you scratch your head, or you chew on the eraser, and you say, yeah, I know that this is a pencil. But then I ask, could you be mistaken about that? Well, yeah, how could you be mistaken? You might be dreaming or hallucinating. Maybe there's no real pencil. Maybe there's no real wherever you are now. Maybe it's all just a dream or an hallucination. Or Descartes suggested that you might have this little devil on your shoulder, which gives you images of a world that isn't there. Or the Matrix movie has the hero with his brain plugged into this evil Macintosh computer, which simulates a world. How do you know that the world is really there? I remember asking this one day after reading maybe too much Descartes, and I said, of course I'm awake and everything is real. And then I woke up and I found that I wasn't. So you could be mistaken about this being a pencil or about anything, right? So if you had knowledge, you couldn't be mistaken, but you could be mistaken about just anything. Therefore, you don't have knowledge. So, Annie, you don't know anything, right? You have no knowledge. I don't know. Well, why don't you know? Well, certainly, I know where my car is parked. I know where I live. I know a lot of things, right? Don't I know anything? Well, you could be mistaken, right? Um, and if you could be mistaken, then you don't know. So you don't really know anything. Ah, but actually, this is not a good argument. What is wrong with the argument? Well, basically, it's the modal ambiguity. If you know, then you couldn't be mistaken. Could be box outside or box inside. And either way, there's a problem with the argument. It's not good reasoning. Let me give you an example of a simpler argument. If you have money, then it couldn't be that you're broke. You couldn't be broke, right? If you have money, you couldn't be broke. But you could be broke. You could always be broke. It could be that coming to class, or actually you're probably in your easy chair somewhere at home or whatever. Maybe you had a hole in your pocket and your money slipped away. So you are broke. Could be. It's possible. So if you have money, it couldn't be that you're broke, but you could be broke. Therefore, you don't have money. Okay. But then you look in your pocket and you say, no, I do have money. So what's wrong? This seems to be a simple if-then. If A, then B, but not B, therefore not A. So if you have money, you couldn't be broke. Could be broke, but you don't have money. That seems to be the logic of it and seems valid. Premises seem true. So what's wrong? What's wrong is this premise is ambiguous. It has our favorite modal fallacy. If you have money, then you couldn't be broke. Could be box outside, or it could be box inside. Either way, there's a problem. So the problem is the first premise isn't clear what it means. Suppose that it means this. It's necessary that if you have money, then you aren't broke. It's true then, right? If you have money, then you aren't broke. But it's possible that you're broke, therefore you don't have money. That doesn't work. You need a stronger premise. You are broke. This premise is not enough just to say it's possible that you're broke. So this is invalid. To reason validly with this premise, it's necessary that if you have money and you're not broke, you have to say you are broke, therefore you don't have money. So this is a bad argument. How about this one? Well, it's valid, but with a false premise. This says if you have money in the actual world, then in no possible world are you broke. And that has very little to say for it. So it seems like a good argument, but it isn't. The problem is the ambiguity. You could take it two ways. Either way is a problem. And that's the same with this one. If you know, then you couldn't be mistaken. But you could be mistaken, therefore you don't know. Now, this could mean this one. If you have knowledge, then you're not mistaken. And that's necessary. It's necessary that if you have knowledge, then you're not mistaken. But then it's invalid, because you need the premise you are mistaken, therefore you don't have knowledge. That you're possibly be mistaken doesn't show that you don't have knowledge. So you need a stronger second premise. This is just invalid. The Nietzschean reason is necessary that if you know, then you're not mistaken. But you are mistaken with a stronger premise, therefore you don't know. So this one is just invalid. The second one has a false premise if you interpret it as the box inside. If you have knowledge, then in every possible world you're not mistaken. Well, maybe if you have knowledge in this world, maybe in another world you're mistaken. There's no problem with that. It's a false premise. Comes out valid, but it says if you have knowledge in the actual world, then in no possible world are you mistaken. false premise. It doesn't prove the conclusion. So neither way does it prove the conclusion. Let's go through mechanically the first argument, the first version, where you have the box outside version. And this will be invalid. Assume K, possible M. Therefore, you put M in a possible world W. It's necessary that if K then not M, you put that in both worlds. You put that in the actual world. K implies not M. And you put it in world W also. K implies not M. And then in the world W, you get if then, deny the second, therefore deny the first, you get not K in world W. And then the actual world, get K. K implies not M, therefore not M. So what you end up with is no contradiction. You have M in world W, and but false in the actual world, but that's okay. The contradiction you need the letter and its denial in the same world. So what you do is you have a galaxy of possible worlds. In the actual world, you know and aren't mistaken. So the actual world stuff you put together here in the box, whereas in world W you have M and not K. You are mistaken and you don't know. So in the actual world, what happens is you know but aren't mistaken, but what could have been is that you're mistaken and you don't know. So in every world, K implies not M because it's true here. It's true here because K is false. So that's true. Possible M, so at least one world has M true. And then not K, you just look to the actual world. False. So you get true premises and false conclusion invalid. So to prove with this premise that you don't know, you have to say you are mistaken. You need a stronger premise. This one comes out as valid. It's so easy to prove, but the problem is that the first premise is bad. It says if you have knowledge in the actual world, then in no possible world are you mistaken, which is very little to say for it. Let's just prove it valid real quickly. Assume K, the possible M you put in world W, M, and then K implies box not M, therefore box not M. And then the necessary thing you drop in world W, not M, and then you get a contradiction. Therefore, valid. So, again, you have two possibilities depending on how you interpret this ambiguous sentence. If you know, then you couldn't be mistaken. One way, box outside, invalid. The other way, box inside, false premise. So in neither way does it prove the conclusion. Okay, now we shift to part 2 of this unit, which is about informal fallacies. What are these? These are deceptive errors of thinking. They're very common, and some of them are really very unsophisticated ways of thinking. They're pretty crude. What we're going to learn is 18 different categories of fallacies, different deceptive error ways of thinking. And then we'll have an exercise where you have a lot of like little passages, and you'll ask which to identify the fallacy committed by each of these little examples. I like to start it off by looking at what a good argument should do. Okay, because a lot of these fallacies are just it not doing what a good argument should do. What do I mean by good argument? Well, could be logically good, and here the important thing is it valid? Does the conclusion follow from the premise, or inductively strong? We didn't do much on inductive reasoning. There's a whole chapter. An example of that would be, most A's are B's, this is an A, therefore it's a B. Probably. Something like that. It's about probability. But it's got to be deductively or inductively strong. That's a good connection between premises and conclusion. It has to have all true premises. That's the logical part of being good, a good argument. True premises, and the conclusion is well based on the premises. But there are other things too, and these are more pragmatic. Why do we argue? Well, a lot of the purpose is to convince people of certain things. We give arguments, we give premises and a conclusion to establish the basis for a belief, or sometimes a way of acting. And there's various ways that these could go wrong. And these are 2, 3, 4, 5, and the fallacies. A good argument in this pragmatic sense should have its validity and truth of premises be as evident as possible to the parties involved. So suppose you appeal to premises that are true, but the people you're talking with don't know that they're true. Well, it's not going to be a very practically effective argument. You've got to appeal to things that people know. Now, ideally, the validity and truth of the premises would be absolutely certain. That's kind of an ideal of argument, that you appeal to absolutely certain premises, and the conclusion follows is absolutely certain that it's valid, and so there you go. However, in real life, you usually almost always appeal to premises that are pretty good, but maybe not absolutely certain. Sometimes you appeal to guesses, maybe the best guess you can do at that particular moment. And is that bad reasoning? Well, no, you're just trying to do as well as you can. Let me give an example of that where you reason on certain premises. Spring break, 1993, I went backpacking. I took the train to West Virginia, and I hiked on a bit of the Appalachian Trail. And there was this massive snowstorm, the third worst killing in terms of deaths storm in the 20th century in the United States. There were 270 people died in this massive snowstorm. Is that as bad as the virus? No, the virus is up to 4,000 American deaths right now, and it will probably get much higher. Who knows? I hope it doesn't get too high. Wow. But so I was hiking, and I was kind of trapped in the snow. It was hard to walk, and I had to find my way out. And a lot of the trail was underneath the snow, and you couldn't really see where you were going a lot of the time. So what do you do in an emergency situation like that? You reason as well as you can. You've got to think. Now, your premises are not going to be absolutely certain. They're going to be sometimes good guesses. A lot of times I use this kind of reasoning. I said the trail goes to the right or to the left. And then I said, well, it doesn't go to the left, therefore it goes to the right. So I would follow it for a while, and then sometimes I would say, well, no, it doesn't go to the right, it goes to the left, and then retrace. So you use reasoning, and reasoning based on guesses, when that's the only thing you have, can save your life. So the ideal is that the validity and truth of the premises be very clear and evident, but sometimes, in real life, it doesn't get that far. The argument should be clearly stated. I criticize Ayer's argument, uncaused. It wasn't quite clear what he meant by that. Using understandable language. Your language in your argument might be correctly stated logically, valid, true, and all that, but it might be too complicated for people to understand. And it might not be clear what the premises or conclusion are. So clarity is an important thing. Also, a good argument should avoid circularity, ambiguity, emotional language, and it should be relevant to the issue at hand. And these are our first 5 fallacies that we will see. Okay. So we will begin our list of fallacies. There's 18 in all. We will start with the first 5. And after doing them, we will look at a lot of different examples of thinking and say which fallacy is committed. These are kind of fun. Okay, so circular. What's a circular argument or question-begging argument? Well, it's where you assume the truth of what has to be proved, or use A to prove B and then B to prove A. Sometimes in a circular argument, the premise is really the same as the conclusion. So I suppose I say the soul is immortal, therefore it cannot die. Well, immortal and cannot die are the same thing. So I haven't really given any further reason. It's like saying A is true, therefore A is true. Or sometimes you argue in a circle. A is true, therefore B is true. B is true, therefore A is true. Why is A true? Because B is true. Why is B true? Because A, you haven't really proved anything. A circular argument. An ambiguous argument is where you change the meaning of a term or phrase within the argument. You've got to keep the meaning of the terms throughout. So if you change the meaning, it is not correct reasoning. In the book, I give kind of a silly example. It says, love is an emotion. God is love. Therefore, God is an emotion. Well, if you say love is an emotion, you're talking about the feeling of love. Okay. If you say God is love, you're not talking about the feeling of love. You're talking about the source of love or a supremely loving person or something like that. So the meaning of the word love varies from a feeling to a person who exemplifies love, or maybe the source of love, something like that. Whatever you mean by your terms in your argument, you got to mean the same thing throughout. Now, the ambiguous argument that we just did in modal logic about knowledge, if you know, then you couldn't be mistaken, is a rather sophisticated form of this fallacy of ambiguity, where what is ambiguous isn't just a term, but it's the whole sentence structure. Could be box inside, box outside. Appeal to emotion involves stirring up emotions instead of arguing in a logical manner. So suppose that you have a philosophy course and the assignment is to argue against a certain theory. Well, that means premises and a conclusion. And often you use a simple if A then B, not B, therefore not A. If the theory is correct, then such and such would follow, but such and such which follows from the theory is wrong, therefore the theory isn't wrong. That's an argument, premises and a conclusion. But instead of arguing against the theory in your paper, you just badmouth it. You just use derogatory language, stirring up emotions. That is not what you're supposed to do. That's an appeal to emotion. You can badmouth anything. You can speak in derogatory language. It doesn't show anything about whether it's good or bad. You got a reason about it. Beside the point is where you argue for a conclusion irrelevant to the issue at hand. This is common with politicians. You ask them a direct question and they give you a nice answer. They prove something, but it's not in the question you asked. It's beside the point, or sometimes called irrelevant. It might prove something, but it's not the issue you're talking about. And don't use this idea too broadly. It's not just the premises aren't relevant to the conclusion. That's not what it's about. It's where you might actually prove something, but it's not the issue that you have to prove. Okay. Straw man argument is where you misrepresent an opponent's view. You're fighting a straw man or a scarecrow instead of an actual person. And this is very common in political debates. Instead of criticizing what your opponent actually holds, you totally distort what the person holds and then fight that. This is rampantly bad. This is a disease that's hitting politics. We distort what the other person holds. The problem with that is you can't hold a rational discussion. A rational discussion is you give your view, I give mine. We don't distort each other. And then I show problems with your view and argue for mine, etc., etc. If you do that, you're going to make progress. If you just distort what the other person said, you're just playing a game. You're just trying to score points, but you're not going to make any progress, and you're going against the spirit of mutual respect and understanding, which you should have when dealing with other people who you disagree with. You say, "This is what you hold. This is what I hold. Let me explain why I think your view is wrong." And then you're treating people as rational beings. If I just distort what you say, oh, bad. I'm just being very unfair. Okay, so that's our first 5 fallacies. We'll do a lot more next time. So homework, do 9, 10, 11, 12, 4 more modal arguments, and then read more about informal fallacies, the rest of the 18. So we'll go through those and start into examples. Logicola, keep doing the modal proofs if you haven't mastered it yet.